Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz just returned from a Blitzbesuch, or a lightning visit, to Beijing. He is the first G7 leader to visit China since the party conference, and I believe the first European leader to visit China since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And his trip with a dozen German CEOs has sparked some controversy. To talk with us about the trip and about relations between China and Germany, I am joined by Noah Barkin. He is a visiting senior fellow in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And he's also managing editor in the China practice of the Rhodium Group. He's based in Berlin and follows Europe's relationship with China and the implications of the relationship between Europe and China on the transatlantic partnership. Noah, it is great to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Steve. Good to be here.
Well, it's good to have you, and I very much look forward to our conversation today because there is a lot to unpack. You and I have been swapping emails for the last 2 or 3 weeks, trying to figure out when the opportune time would be to have this conversation, because it seems like every week there's something new. Scholz's trip, of course, comes just on the heels of his decision to push through the approval of Chinese shipping giant COSCO's bid for a stake in a Hamburg port terminal, over the objections of a number of his cabinet members and Germany's intelligence services. And it also comes in the run-up to the release of a new national security strategy, as well as a new China strategy, both of which are slated to be released maybe at the end of this year, but certainly in January. So there are a lot of different elements to talk about, but I thought we could start by getting your take on Scholz's trip to Beijing at the end of last week.
Yeah, Steve, a lot going on. Thanks for having me. Maybe in talking about the Scholz trip, I can provide a little context first. Scholz has been chancellor since December, so almost a year now. He came in as part of a three-party coalition government that promised a shift in Germany's policy towards China. The Merkel years, the 16 years that Merkel was in power, were characterized by a deepening of the economic relationship between Germany and China, and deepening of the investment relationship, and not so much talk about human rights issues and some of the more contentious issues in the Germany-China relationship. So this government came in talking differently about China, and it is working on a new China strategy that you just mentioned. I think that will come in the spring, after the national security strategy, which we expect probably by the Munich Security Conference in February. These keep getting pushed back, but came in talking about a shift in policy, and that was embedded in the coalition agreement. So this new China strategy is expected to focus very much on the dependencies that Germany has built up with China, reducing these dependencies, focusing on resilience. So a shift in tone. So this is the context in which Scholz went to Beijing, and I think no one. My personal view is that talking with Xi Jinping is necessary. He's probably the only person, that was the lesson from the Party Congress, the only person perhaps that it's worth talking to in China these days. All the power is now centered with the Secretary General of the Communist Party and the President, Xi Jinping. So I think, Scholz has been chancellor for nearly a year. Not unusual for him to want to sit down with Xi Jinping. That hasn't been possible because of the COVID restrictions in China. But I think this trip was seen as problematic for three reasons. One was the timing. So soon after the Party Congress, Scholz is likely to see Xi in about a week in Bali for the G20 summit. So there was a feeling, did he really need to go out there so soon after the Party Congress when he was going to see Xi anyway in Indonesia in mid-November? I think one of the other criticisms was Scholz's decision to take a business delegation with him, 12 CEOs from a range of German companies, including the companies that are most heavily invested in China: Volkswagen, BASF, Siemens, etc. So the feeling was, and certainly I've written about this, that at a time when his government and his ministers are working on a China strategy focused on reducing Germany's dependence on China, going to China with a business delegation sort of sent the opposite message. And I think the third problem that I saw with the visit, and that many others did, was the Costco deal that you mentioned in your introduction. This is, Costco, the Chinese shipping giant, has stakes in many European ports. It does not have a stake in the Hamburg port. But it does have stakes in Chinese shipping companies have stakes in the two main competitors for Hamburg, Rotterdam and Antwerp. And so the Chinese, what Costco does is says to the ports here in Europe, you give us a stake and we'll funnel traffic to your port. If you don't, then it's going to go to your competitors. So this is sort of a bit of a blackmail situation. That's why Hamburg was considering this. Scholz is the former mayor of Hamburg. He was pushing, during his 7 years as mayor, he pushed very aggressively for a closer relationship with China and the port. But 6 of his ministers, the German intelligence agencies, the European Commission, and many of Germany's allies in Europe and outside of Europe were opposed to this deal. He rammed it through. The terms of the deal were changed slightly to reduce the stake. But this was seen, it took place about a week before Scholz traveled to Beijing. This was seen as the timing was problematic, I think, because it looked like a gift to Xi Jinping. And we do know that Chinese diplomats had been warning the German government that they wanted to see this deal approved and that there might be consequences if it wasn't approved. So these are the reasons that I think people saw this trip as problematic. Now, Scholz I think he made the best of what was a pretty bad situation by raising a lot of the contentious issues when he was there. He talked about Xinjiang, he talked about Taiwan, he talked about China's coercion against Lithuania, without mentioning Lithuania, but indirectly he raised that. The sanctions against European parliamentarians, which were introduced in March of last year. And he talked about the problems of German business and European businesses in China. So I think people are giving him a bit of people who are critical of the trip, including myself, I think are saying, well, he didn't completely botch this. He did communicate some of the messages that needed to be sent. And I didn't mention the issue of Russia and Ukraine and China's support for Russia. He did secure a a message from Xi Jinping that that China would frown upon an escalation in Ukraine, frown upon the use or the threat to use nuclear weapons. So that is being hailed as a big accomplishment by the Scholz team. I think other people are quite skeptical about whether Xi Jinping, whether that means much, and whether Xi Jinping will really put a great deal of pressure on Putin, whether he has, whether he can control Putin, and whether Chinese messages like this about the fact that they don't want a nuclear escalation will have a real impact on Putin's thinking. But that is the view of the Scholz trip. I think a lot of criticism in the run-up to the trip, a sort of a glass half full view of how he performed. But I think, ultimately, what this leaves us with is the sense that the government here in Berlin is very divided on China. The Greens ministers in his government, Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, Robert Habeck, the economy minister, are clearly pushing in a very different direction than Scholz is. And Europe is also fairly divided. We saw a row between Berlin and Paris over this trip. Macron wanted to go with Scholz. Scholz said no. And there was a bit of a back and forth over who was going when. My view is always that Germany's sway in China depends on unity in Berlin, unity in the EU, and unity at the G7 level. If everyone is pulling together, then there is a degree of influence in Beijing. Scholz went to Beijing, leaving a very divided government in Berlin, divided EU, and clearly some of Germany's G7 partners were not happy with this either.
So thank you, Noah. Thanks for sort of setting the stage for us. I think there are a number of different themes that we can pick up on and circle back to. And certainly in the course of our conversation, I'd like to come back to some of the divisions within Germany in terms of the different views that we're seeing within the Ampel coalition, and then also talk a little bit more about divisions within Europe and get your take on how Europe needs to show this sense of unity. But before we do that, I want to sort of come back to these three observations that you had and these three criticisms of why the trip was problematic, the timing, the business focus, and then immediately on the heels of the Costco deal. There is certainly a lot of head scratching about the Costco deal and the implications of that. And yet some of the people that I've spoken with have said it's not really such a big deal, because this is one of four harbors. It's only 24.9% control rather than the 33% control that they wanted to have. But I think that there's really widespread recognition that the optics of this are just not very good. And so the question that comes out of that, if one agrees that the optics are not good, and I think each of the 3 points that you made are questions of optics as well as the substance that you talked about, did Scholz give up leverage that Berlin might have had over Beijing too easily as a result of this trip? And I guess the question is then, what kind of leverage are we talking about? But I'm thinking specifically about China's support of Russia up to now. If we want to try to bring the war in Ukraine to some sort of an end, it would be helpful to have China weigh in as well. And then, of course, particularly since COP27 is going on right now, there's widespread understanding that in order to address climate change, China will have to be at the table. And so, my question to you is did Scholz give away too much too early in order to try to address the myriad challenges that we face right now?
Yeah, my view is that he did, and the situation is reminiscent of the back in at the end of 2020 when Merkel was still chancellor. Some of the listeners may remember that she pushed through at the very end of December, between Christmas and New Year's 2020, this EU-China investment agreement. And this was just weeks before the Biden administration was entering the White House, and was also, in my view, because the deal itself did not accomplish a great deal. It was handing China's leadership a geopolitical victory, just weeks before the Biden administration came in, and I think there are parallels with this trip. Scholz's government has been promising a new approach. It's working on this China strategy, which is a central part of the strategy is sort of a rethink of the economic relationship, which I think in past decades has been seen as a huge advantage that Germany had, its economic ties with China. Increasingly, it's being seen as a vulnerability, as a source of blackmail potential by China, especially in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think Scholz had an opportunity to send some different signals. He could have either waited to the G20 to meet with Xi and gone to Beijing at a later date. He could have said to Macron, yes, let's go together, and maybe let's bring the Polish prime minister. We're going to do this differently going forward, because as some of you may recall, Macron back in 2019, when Xi Jinping was coming through Paris, he invited Merkel, he invited European Commission President at the time, Jean-Claude Juncker, to send a signal Europe is united, and France is not going to be doing French deals. We're going to talk as one. Now that it's hard to find the perfect mix of European leaders. When the French and Germans talk with China together, then the Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans are unhappy. But I think Scholz had a chance to sort of set a new tone here. And the message was really, it was sort of a Germany first message, going there with a business delegation. I do think the messages that he sent needed to be sent, especially on Russia, and because I think people here in Berlin and elsewhere in Europe are very concerned about the risks of a Russian escalation, the use of potentially of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. This is something that I think members of the Russian military have discussed. So the argument of the Scholz team is that this is an urgent challenge, and we needed to go to Beijing and get China's support on this matter. But in my view, this was a missed opportunity to kind of reset the way Germany interacts with China, and it does undermine, I think, to a certain extent, the Scholz's own ministers, the foreign minister who has the lead in writing this new China strategy, and it was criticized by other European capitals at the last European Council as well.
So I'd like to come back to sort of the domestic piece and the transatlantic piece in just a moment. But since you were talking about this European context, I want to let our viewers know that you have a monthly newsletter, Watching China in Europe, and I'll post the link to that so people can sign up for it. And in the most recent edition, you talked a little bit about sort of this division between Berlin and Paris that you started to talk about just now, and this rift, because you had kind of scooped the story that Scholz and Macron were supposed to go together, and then they're going separately, and Scholz is pushing his trip through now, and Macron, I guess, is not going to go until spring of 2023. Can you talk a little bit more about why you think it's so troubling that Berlin is having sort of a Germany first policy, and why we're not seeing the kind of European unity? I mean, do you think that other countries will go along with a more rigid policy toward China if they see Germany sort of giving in on some of these questions?
Well, I think the important point to make here, Steve, is that Germany is obviously the biggest country in the EU, has the closest economic relationship with China. And I think a very important part of forging a more united European policy towards China is Germany showing that it is willing to perhaps pay a short-term economic price for the longer-term goal of more unity in Europe. So if other countries in Europe see Germany saying, okay, we're going to block this Costco deal, even though it might hurt the port in Hamburg. There's a debate about another Chinese bid for a German semiconductor manufacturer that the economy ministry was considering allowing. It does look like that's going to be blocked now, but if Germany is sending signals, we're willing to pay a price for European unity, and even if that costs us economically to some extent, then other European countries are going to follow. I think if Germany is perceived to be pursuing its own national interests, its own economic interests, then other countries in Europe are going to have very little incentive to pay a price themselves, because obviously in engaging with China, if the more you push back, the higher the risk that China responds, and that you end up paying an economic price. So I think I'm under no illusions. I think the French, they had, they're being opportunistic. I don't think they're sort of holier than thou on China, and that and one can say that maybe France has been just as eager to do deals with China as Germany has in recent years. But I think it's very problematic when Germany and France, or other European countries for that matter, sort of expose their divisions in front of Beijing, and that's what happened a bit on this trip. My understanding is that after Scholz asked Macron, after Macron asked Scholz to go together, and he said no, then Macron made plans for his own trip, and this was not well received in the chancellery here in Berlin, and there was a bit of a tiff between Berlin and Paris about who was going when, and this just does not look good, especially when Xi Jinping is looking at this, and Europe has leverage. Europe has leverage with China when it's united, and we've seen we've seen a very I think it's been mishandled this over the past weeks, the Costco deal, the trips, and all that. Now, does that mean that We have continuity between the Merkel era and the Scholz era. I don't believe that. I think that Germany and Europe have been heading in one direction on China for about 5 years now. Sometimes it's a sort of one step forward, two steps backwards situation. But I think the pressures, the pressures from Germany's allies, what is happening in China, a pretty significant economic slowdown, demographic problems, a property crisis, which will make the Chinese market less attractive. The iron hand of the state in the economy in China under Xi Jinping makes it much more difficult for foreign companies operating there. So the tide is shifting, and the German government as a whole, I think, recognizes that. It's just that in this instance with this trip, a signal was sent in the other direction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, related to this, one refrain that we've been hearing for a while is that certainly Germany, but even more broadly, Europe does not want to get caught between China and the United States. And so I'd like to sort of fold in two different viewer questions that pick up on this kind of transatlantic component, if you will. One of our viewers writes, asking whether or not there's been a cooling recently in Europe's resolve against China because of US-EU trade rifts. She goes on to say that just this week we heard European officials complaining about US attempts to subsidize American production of electric vehicle inputs as a possible violation of international trade rules. At the same time, Europe does not appear to be on board with the US's recent export controls banning the sale of advanced chips to China. And so the question there is, how does the US and how does the transatlantic relationship feed into this?
Yeah, and maybe we can talk about U.S. politics. The midterms are taking place today as well. Yes, I mean, the Europeans, and not just the Europeans, the Japanese, the South Koreans have been are not very happy with the certain elements of the Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits for electric vehicles, which are seen as protectionist, discriminatory. So that has been an issue, and now a task force has been set up. I was speaking with a European Commission official earlier today who made very clear, this is a problem that we have, but we don't want this to overshadow the relationship. We want to keep this contained, and this is not going to blow up the transatlantic relationship, but we do need to sit down with Washington and talk about it. The export controls, I think the Europeans, there was an effort by Washington to talk with key allies on this ahead of time, try to get a group of countries to move together. In Europe, the country that's most affected is the Netherlands because of ASML, which is a major producer of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. The Japanese were also involved in these discussions, and the US at some point felt we're not going to get a plurilateral deal on this, so we're going to move on our own. I think they did flag to the Europeans ahead of time that this was coming, the technology controls. But there's still, some ruffled feathers in Brussels about, they feel that maybe the depth of these controls went a bit further than they had been told ahead of time. I think the real problem here is that, the United States is looking at the technology relationship with China in depth. The Biden administration has been looking at this since it came into the White House. Thinking about how to structure this relationship and where controls are needed. semiconductors is the real choke point in China. And the Europeans are not thinking about this in the same amount of depth, in part because they don't have as many companies that are affected. I mentioned ASML, that is a big one, but Europe as a whole is not as affected. So I think when the US and Europe talk with each other about technology, the technology relationship with China, they're the US is talking from a point of view of, they've done a lot of work on this, and the Europeans have not. So the Europeans are in reactive mode. They haven't done the work necessary to talk with the US at sort of eye level. So we'll have to see how this goes. The next Trade and Technology Council meeting is coming up at the beginning of December. I think it's very important that the US and the EU deliver some big concrete deliverables at that meeting. This is the third meeting of the TTC. It has 10 working groups. It's sucking up a lot of bandwidth on both sides of the Atlantic. So it's very important to deliver something concrete at this next meeting on December 5th. I think these are very complex issues. We're talking about supply chains. We're talking about export controls, investment screening. So not easy to resolve, but something that the US and EU definitely need to hunker down and address, because the Biden administration, I think it is probably the most transatlantic administration Europe is going to get for a while, and I think they need to show that this relationship can deliver in the window that they have.
And of course, I mean, that window might be about to close. You mentioned the fact that, of course, today is election day in the U.S. Our midterms are being watched, here at home in the U.S., but also across Europe, very, very closely with a lot of interest. And I think that depending on how the vote goes, despite the transatlantic nature of the Biden administration, it might not be able to do as much as it would like to if the Democrats lose control of the House and Senate, and that could have implications for exactly the issues that we're talking about when it comes to dealing with China, but also dealing with Europe. And so the TTC might have a very different flavor indeed. I'd like to sort of pick up on something else, though, and fold in another question from one of our viewers who is curious about how NATO members, and I would argue also how G7 members, can simultaneously maintain their own economic and political stability while continuing to provide support to Ukraine, and, she writes, decouple from a weakening and weakened China. I don't think that you're advocating a decoupling, but I do think that, and this is where the Scholz visit and some of the decisions by Berlin are important, having maybe a more measured response to the relationship with China, particularly given the need for China to be involved in non-proliferation issues when it comes to Iran and North Korea, but also to climate issues. So as you sort of take a step back and look at the broad picture, there are these other clubs, if you will, the G7, NATO. How do those institutions, but how do the members in those institutions balance these very different challenges, sort of keep China at a distance on some things, but engaged and involved on others?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real dilemma, especially for a country like Germany, which, I think Germany's prosperity has been built on, on the one hand, cheap Russian energy, which it's no longer getting. And Germany is suffering the economic, the economic backlash from having to sever its ties to to Russian oil and gas in a very short period of time. The other pillar has been U.S. Security guarantees within NATO. That is also something which I think we're seeing crumbling a bit. You know, Trump talked about pulling out of NATO, and I think there's a huge concern here in Europe that if we get a shift in a change of administration in 2024, that you could have an administration that is you know, much more skeptical towards the transatlantic relationship, more skeptical towards NATO, and also Ukraine, right? Ukraine, we're hearing some voices, I think mainly on the Republican side, saying we don't want to pay another cent for Ukraine. So that is something. I think there's a legitimate point that some U.S. politicians have that Europe needs to step up, and we did have this speech from Chancellor Olaf Scholz several days after the start of the war in Ukraine, his Zeitenwende speech, where he announced plans to invest 100 billion euros additionally in the German military. So Germany is moving there, but if you look at Germany's economic headwinds, that Germany faces from the war in Ukraine, if you look at the concerns in Germany about perhaps a return to a more confrontational approach from Washington vis-a-vis Europe, and you look at the trade relationship with China, you know, there are people who argue that you can't open another front with China at a time when, you know, there's a war going on in Europe, and there's a risk that the U.S. is shifting to or could return to a more confrontational approach with Europe. My view is that you know, we're not talking about full-scale decoupling. The idea that one can sever all economic ties with China is a fallacy. And I think a legacy of the Trump administration, where I think there were certain people, Peter Navarro comes to mind, who suggested that this could be done. No one in the Biden administration is talking about full-scale decoupling. I mean, I think it's in Germany's interest and it's in Europe's interest to rethink the relationship with China, and we're not talking about, this is a longer-term challenge. You know, we're talking 10 years, 5 to 10 years. It's about reducing vulnerabilities. It's about diversifying. It's about becoming more resilient. And this is in Germany and Europe's national interests. And of course, you need to keep a dialogue alive with China if you can. And I think you need to talk with China. China is too big to ignore. You know, there are big global issues that one can only solve with China. I think I would question whether being conciliatory with China will necessarily deliver results on climate change or something like that. I think you have to formulate your strategy around your national interests, and of course you have to remain open to engagement with China. I think if the Chinese leadership understands that, if it's a clear message, then they will. I mean, combating climate change is in China's interest as well. So yes, resilience, diversification, no sudden decoupling, But having a plan, 5 to 10 years out, that's what's needed here in Germany and in Europe.
Well, and as you've said a couple times, right, build resilience, but also reduce dependencies. And I'm happy that you mentioned the Zeitenwende speech by Olaf Scholz, which we've been hearing a lot about, right, in terms of setting a new trajectory for Germany's foreign security and energy policies. And I guess the big question for me, and this was what was the catalyst for my reaching out to you several weeks ago, was to kind of pose the question of whether or not Germany is drawing lessons from its shift in its Russlandpolitik or Russia policy when it comes to relations with China and its China policy. And you've already indicated that there is a sense that the government is somewhat divided. Certainly when Annalena Baerbock came into her role as foreign minister, she was more hawkish on China and on Russia than Scholz was. We're seeing that play out at the moment in terms of different positions by the Greens, as you mentioned, Robert Habeck, the Minister of Economic Affairs and Climate, and Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, versus the chancellor. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about how these different views on China are playing out in the Ampel coalition, but also, hear from you whether you think that Germany is drawing the necessary lessons from the experiences of this year and recognition of kind of the trap that these dependencies can cause.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. I think, when you think about what happened with German business in Russia, they had to pull out almost overnight, and that has not been a huge problem for most German companies who did not have a major presence in Russia. The war has affected Germany much more on the energy side because of the dependence on Russian oil and gas. But if you look at the risks surrounding Taiwan, if we had a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, if you had a Chinese invasion, or something that stopped short of that, seizing of islands, a blockade, something like that, then I think we would see a response from the U.S. And there would be huge pressure on Europe to introduce economic sanctions against China, similar to the sanctions that have been leveled at Russia. Now, that would have a huge economic impact. I think Taiwan is so important economically because of its role in the semiconductor supply chain, because of the role of TSMC, its big semiconductor company, that this would have a global, a major global impact. But for a country like Germany, whose biggest companies, many of them are very heavily invested in China and depend on the Chinese market very, very heavily. The car makers, for example, making sort of between a third and a half of their revenues in China. This is very, very worrying because if you did have sanctions, they would be under pressure to pull out of China. Now, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but if you think that there is a risk that of a conflict in Taiwan 5 to 10 years from now, then you have to start preparing now for that. I think this is a decision and that has been, well, these are considerations that have been accelerated by the war in Ukraine and the lessons from Germany's dependency on Russia, which there were warnings, also coming from Washington about this, and Germany pretended that, for example, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was a purely business or
Commercial
economic project rather than a geopolitical project, which we now, I think, know it very much is and was. So I think there are two camps. You know, you have a camp here in Berlin that is saying Russia is a blaring red alarm signal, and we need to learn the lessons of our dependency on Russia and rethink the relationship with China so that we're not in a much worse situation with China in the event of a Taiwan scenario or something like that. And then you have people, and I think this includes people around Olaf Scholz, who repeat the line, China is not Russia. And I think we can all agree China is not Russia. I don't think Xi Jinping is gonna act as impulsively as Putin did in Ukraine. I think China is not. China will want to be 95% sure that any military operation in Taiwan, for example, is going to be successful before they move, because a defeat would be devastating for the Chinese Communist Party and their and the one-party state rule in China. So I think you have a camp saying we need to learn the lessons, and I think that includes the foreign minister who is working on this China strategy and is embedding some of these messages from Russia in that strategy. And then you have a group that is saying, you know, we need to engage with China. We need to convince them to use their influence on Russia. This no limits partnership that we saw between Putin and Xi shortly before the start of the war. This isn't really what China meant, and you know, trying to see see the glass as half full with China. I think it was very interesting. We had testimony from the head of the German Foreign Intelligence Agency and the head of the German Domestic Intelligence Agency, so the equivalents of the CIA and the FBI, in recent weeks, and the head of the BND, the German equivalent of the CIA, said that you know, they've been warning German politicians about China for years, and that they refuse to see the writing on the wall on many issues. You know, whether it's 5G, whether it's this Costco deal. So there are still people in prominent positions in Berlin who when looking at China, want to see, I think, want to see what, you know, a best case scenario coming out of all of this, despite all the signs, from the Party Congress. So this is a debate that's happening in Berlin. It's, by the way, a very intense debate that's been going on about China policy for a number of years, far more intense than I think in any other European country. Maybe in the UK that we've had this, but so that's good. People are talking about it. That's a start.
So related to that, in terms of people talking about it and addressing this issue, we've talked, you know, a little bit about the fact that this very first national security strategy is supposed to come out, and that the China strategy is supposed to come out after that. We had heard that both would be released before the end of the year. It now looks like the national security strategy will be released, as you say, prior to the Munich Security Conference. I had heard some hope that the China strategy would be released before then as well, but you indicated perhaps not until the spring. I can't imagine a national security strategy that does not include China. So I would hope that these two strategies are abgestimmt, right? That they're coherent and thought through. And I guess one question I would have for you is from what you're hearing, what do you expect to see in the national security strategy related to China, and what do you expect to see in the China strategy? And who do you think is calling the shots? Obviously there's some, when it comes to foreign policy, that we saw this in the Merkel years. We're certainly seeing it in Scholz's term already. There's some back and forth between the chancellery and the foreign ministry, but who's sort of setting the trajectory when it comes to these two forward-looking strategies?
Well, these strategies are both being written in the foreign ministry. By different people, but there is coordination between the people working on the China strategy and the people working on the national security strategy. And I think it's important to note that Germany has never produced a national security strategy before. So this is a new process. It's something that in Washington happens with every new administration. But for Germany, it's a heavy lift because I think Germany has traditionally not thought in terms of its national interests in the way that many other countries do. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, I think there was a sense here that the world was sort of bending in Germany's direction, and it turns out that it isn't. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what these strategies look like. I think these are both going to be public strategies. So I would have preferred to see a confidential China strategy and maybe a speech, as we saw in Washington with Blinken giving a speech with the sort of the highlights from that strategy. I think it's hard to write a public China strategy and really say what you think, but they're gonna try to do that. I think both strategies are going to say that the world has become a tougher place, and that Germany faces a much more. Germany is vulnerable, and it faces a much more dangerous global landscape. We talked about the three pillars: Russian energy, China trade and investment, U.S. security. You remove those three pillars, and Germany is at a place where it has to reinvent itself, right? It has to invest a lot more in its military. It has to look for other markets outside of China to reduce its dependencies, and it needs to reinvent its energy strategy. So I think we're going to get a strong sense that a more difficult, challenging world lies ahead. We heard a speech from German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier just about a week ago, where he kind of laid this out. And we haven't heard this a lot from Olaf Scholz, the message that Germans need to sort of buckle up for a more difficult couple years. So I think that will come across in the strategy. Asking who has the final say, I think what I expect is that the foreign ministry will write these strategies. I think a first draft of the China strategy and the national security strategy is ready, and the NSS is being circulated to ministries. The China strategy, I think, will be in the coming months. And they're in the foreign ministry on China, they're expecting the chancellery to go through this with a red pen, because the message that I've heard from people in Berlin is that the chancellery does not want a China strategy that damages the relationship with China. So I think this is going to be a real interesting, tug of war. I don't think the Chancellery will want to overplay its hand, but I don't have huge expectations for what these strategies will accomplish. I think the process of putting them together is very helpful because it can crystallize thoughts and ideas. But I think there's only so much that strategies like this, that a document like this can do. Ultimately, it's political will to implement the ideas in these strategies.
Well, and as we've seen with the Zeitenwende speech, right? I mean, a direction has been set, and there's been some criticism as to how quickly Germany has moved in that direction, but certainly some commitments have been made. And so my guess is at the latest, when we know more about the China strategy, I'll be asking you to come back to parse it with us and to tell us what's in it, but also what's missing. So I look forward to continuing the conversation. But before I let you go, I have maybe one final question. I mean, you talked about sort of the difficult and challenging global environment that we're all facing, but particularly that Germany is facing. And I think many people are watching the relationship between China and Taiwan, and there are concerns of kind of a repeat of Russia's invasion of Ukraine by China in Taiwan. And yet some of the people that I talk with are a little bit more sanguine about this, because they point to China's economic slowdown, to the demographic crisis that you mentioned before, and also to China's global reputation. And they say China simply cannot afford financially and morally a kind of situation like the one that Russia finds itself in. How concerned are you about action that China might take against Taiwan?
Well, I'm not a China expert. I have been following Europe's relationship with China for a number of years now. I've been following the transatlantic discussion on China. So there are much smarter people who could answer this question with, who have much more expertise on this. What I know is that Xi Jinping has made very clear that this is a goal of his, reunification or unification with Taiwan. We know that he has put the Chinese military on track to, over the coming half decade, reach a point where it feels comfortable that it could force a unification. And we also know, based on, if you look at the COVID-19 policy, if you look at how Xi Jinping is approaching the economy, where ideology and politics is increasingly trumping what we saw in recent decades in China, which was the sort of the economic imperative and the desire to grow and ensure prosperity. So I think nobody knows what's going on in Xi Jinping's head, but there are signs that this is something that he wants, and there are signs, I think, that he is willing to sacrifice reputational damage, economic damage in pursuit of political objectives. So I know that people in Washington are very concerned. They see I think a shorter timeline than people here in Europe see, who are more optimistic that this is not something that is in China's interests and is unlikely to happen, especially at a time when China's facing a lot of economic headwinds. But we don't know, and I think it's the wrong approach would be to assume that it's not going to happen and not to prepare for this possibility.
Mm-hmm. Well, Noah, I want to thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today. This has been a very thoughtful and very thought-provoking conversation, and I really appreciate it. I'd like to give another shout out to your monthly newsletter, Watching China in Europe. As I mentioned, I posted the sign up link in the chat, but I'm sure that people can also find it if they go to the German Marshall Fund's website, gmfusa.org, and just look at the Asia program and look for your name. But Noah, thank you again for tuning in from Berlin. It's always good to see you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve. And let's get together again when the China strategy and the national security strategy are out.
Excellent. Take care.
Okay, you too.